After leaving the big city, I moved to a place where there's practically nothing. And it's here that I decided to buy my own land and start farming. Over the next 5 years, we'll rebuild our farm, construct many new buildings and productions. The main goal is to start earning hundreds of thousands of dollars every month. If you're interested, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Now let's head to the farm. First of all, I decided to start with restoring our farm, but before everything it needed to be bought, so I went there. When I arrived at the place, the farm pleasantly surprised me. The territory turned out to be quite large. Especially, I was interested in one of the barns standing on the plot. Looking inside, I discovered a quad bike, and a little further, behind the trees, I noticed an old broken tractor. Having examined the entire territory, I saw many abandoned buildings and even an unfinished house. Under another unfinished barn, of which only the frame remained, I found an old disc cultivator. In general, the plot turned out to be very good, so I decided to purchase it. For the farm, I paid $170,000, and now it was necessary to develop it so that it would begin to bring income. Since after the purchase, I had a little money left, the first thing I decided to do was sell the found quad bike. We did not especially need it, and the money would be useful. Loading the vehicle into the bed of the pickup, I went to the store. On the spot, I managed to get almost $1,500, which in general is quite good. While I was there, at the same time, I purchased a chainsaw. After all, selling trees at the beginning of the game can bring a good income, and without a chainsaw, it is impossible to transport logs. I also bought a trailer for the pickup. In addition, I took a set of tools and canisters with diesel fuel. Since I was going to restore the found tractor, loading everything necessary into the bed, I went back to the farm. Now, when everything is ready, it is possible to go to the farm. It is very good that we have our own pickup. At the beginning, it really helps a lot because the road to the store is quite long, and with it, we manage much faster. As soon as I arrived at the farm, the first thing I decided to do was unload everything that we had bought. After that, I headed into the forest to cut down a few trees and earn my first money. The forest was located right behind our farm, and the road to it passed through a small river. Fortunately, there was a small bridge for passing there. Having reached the place, I cut down one tree, then sawed it into small logs. Driving closer with the pickup, I began loading them into the bed. There was not much space there, but still I managed to stack several logs, for which we also would be able to get money. When the bed of the pickup was completely loaded, I began loading the remaining wood into the trailer. Everything else fit there exactly. Now, it was possible to go to the sawmill to sell our first goods. However, already about to leave, I remembered that I had forgotten to fasten the logs with straps. Quickly doing this, I again sat behind the wheel and set off. To my surprise, the pickup turned out to be powerful enough to pull such a heavy load, and I reached the place quite quickly. At the sawmill, I unloaded the trailer, removed the straps, and sold the wood. For everything, we received a little more than $3,000. The sum, although small, but for a start, very good. Now it was possible to return to the farm, because ahead, a lot of work was still waiting for us. As soon as I arrived at the place, I decided to deal with the found tractor. We already had everything necessary, so I placed the set of tools nearby and began the repair. After some time, I managed to fix everything. We were really lucky. For its restoration, no additional investments were required. I sat in the cab, turned the key, and the engine immediately started. Everything worked perfectly. However, there was very little fuel left in the tank, so I took the canister and filled the diesel fuel to the top. Now, the tractor was completely ready for work. I was especially pleased that it had cost us almost nothing. In fact, we had spent only on the tools. After this, I decided to attach the old disc cultivator which I had found earlier. Driving the tractor closer, I examined it and understood that it could not do without repair. The restoration of the cultivator cost about $450, a small sum, but now we had our own equipment with which it was possible to cultivate the soil and create new fields. When the work was finished, I tidied up on the farm and threw the canisters back into the bed of the pickup. Since there was still money on the balance, I decided to demolish the old barn in which I had earlier found the quad bike. The dismantling cost a little more than $6,000, and instead of it, I built a new modern barn costing $18,000. After all, machinery needs to be stored somewhere. When the construction was completed, I immediately drove the pickup and the tractor inside. The day was already coming to an end, so it was necessary to think about a place to rest. The house on the plot still remained unfinished, so I set up a tent nearby. For today, it was possible to confidently finish. A huge amount of work had been done. The next morning, the weather turned out not to be the best. The sky was covered with clouds, and a cool wind was blowing. Nevertheless, this should not have interfered with the work. I immediately headed to our tractor because today I wanted to create the first field. I chose a plot of land right in front of our farm, lowered the cultivator, and began plowing. Almost immediately, I noticed that it was quite hard for the tractor to pull it. It even seemed to me that the cultivator was too big for such a machine. After making several passes, I noticed that the tractor's wheels were slipping badly. At first, I thought the matter was in the machinery, but then I noticed that the soil in this place had never been cultivated before, and only then I understood what the reason was. The ground here turned out to be too wet. Apparently, the groundwater lies very close to the surface, because of which the tractor slides and loses traction with the soil. Cultivation work took much more time than I expected. I had to move slowly so that the tractor would not slip, but despite this, I still managed. When the field was completely plowed, I sighed with relief. Now we had our own first field. I hope the harvest on it will be good and bring us a decent income. However, before receiving profit, it was necessary to plant a crop. For this, a seeder was required, and we did not yet have money for its purchase. Therefore, I decided to go again into the forest to cut some wood and sell it in order to get the necessary amount. Cutting down one more tree, I sawed it into parts, loaded the logs into the bed of the pickup, and took them to the sawmill. The sale brought me a little less than $7,000, a good result. After this, I returned to the farm, got into the tractor, and went to the store. There, I bought the simplest and cheapest seeder for only $2,000, and also bought several bags of seeds. Attaching the equipment to the tractor, I headed back to the farm. Not reaching the house, I immediately drove onto our new field. As the first crop, I decided to sow canola. It is unpretentious to the soil, and besides, the sowing season was just coming to an end. Therefore, I immediately began to work. By the time the sun began to lean towards sunset, the field was completely sown. Now it only remained to wait until the canola sprouted. At that, I decided to finish the day. I put all the machinery in the barn and went to rest. The next morning, I decided to do some cleaning on our farm. The territory turned out to be quite large, so I decided to start at least with the entrance. In construction mode, I removed all the grass that was growing right in the middle of the road. After that, the area immediately began to look much neater, which could not but please the eye. While the canola on our field continued to grow and money was extremely necessary for us, the only way of earning remained the sale of wood. To earn more, I decided to purchase a larger trailer. Fortunately, we already had a tractor that could pull it. I went to the store and chose there the cheapest trailer for logs. It turned out to be quite large, even a bit too big for our tractor, but I thought that with effort our tractor would still pull it. With thoughts about the money we would earn, I headed to the forest. Arriving there, I began cutting and loading the trees into the new trailer as soon as the trailer was completely loaded. By the way, several trees fit into it. I decided to see where, at the moment, the highest prices for wood were. It turned out that now it was most profitable to sell wood at the railway station. Therefore, I sat on our tractor and set off on the road. By the way, I noticed that even on loose soil, it coped with the trailer, and on the dirt road, it went without any difficulty at all. Arriving at the station, I was very disappointed. It turned out that they no longer needed wood. Therefore, I had to go to the sawmill, where we had sold wood earlier. The road took a lot of time, since during that time it was necessary to travel quite a long distance. But in the end, we still reached it. For this trailer of logs, we were paid almost $9,500. At least, something made me glad. So I decided not to stop and continue the work. I was doing this all winter and spring, and only by the end of spring, I finally finished the work. During all this time, I managed to earn a little more than $100,000. Working was really hard, but now this money could be spent on developing and improving our farm. Returning home from the sawmill, I decided to do something else. Since by that time the grass had already grown, the choice was obvious. It was the right time to start harvesting hay. First, it was necessary to buy a mower so that it would be possible to cut the grass. Therefore, I went to the store. There, I chose a simple but reliable model, which cost only $5,000. Attaching it to our tractor, I headed back to the farm. When I arrived, the sun was already beginning to set, so I decided to put all the machinery in the barn and continue the work tomorrow. The next morning, I immediately began mowing the grass. I decided to cut quite a large area in order to earn as much money as possible. By noon, the mowing work was completely finished, and now it remained to decide how to process all the grass for further transportation and sale. Selling it raw would be too cheap, so I decided first to press it into bales. For this, it was necessary to purchase a baler. I left the mower at the farm and headed to the store. Arriving at the place, I immediately chose the cheapest baler for round bales. It cost $12,500. Attaching it to the tractor, I headed back to the farm. As soon as I drove onto the hayfield, I realized that I had forgotten to buy the special net with which the baler wraps the bales so that they do not fall apart. I had to run again to the pickup and drive back to the store. This time, I immediately bought several rolls of net, paying almost $1,500 for them. Loading everything into the bed of the pickup, I went back to the farm. There, I unloaded the rolls and installed them into our baler. Now everything was ready for work. And just as I wanted to start working, I became very upset. It turned out that our tractor simply did not have enough power, even to start the baler. Therefore, I made the only right decision to go again to the store and purchase a new, more powerful tractor. Fortunately, we had just enough money for such a purchase. Arriving at the store, I began choosing machinery that would be ideal for our work. After a short reflection, I settled on a tractor of the Case brand. It had more than enough power, and to improve traction with the ground, I installed wheels of increased width. They were supposed to help not get stuck in the swampy area where our farm is located. This decision made it possible to get better grip on viscous soil. In addition, this tractor had a comfortable, spacious cab, which would make work much more pleasant. The machine had front-wheel drive and was distinguished by high reliability. I seated a worker behind the wheel of the new tractor, and I myself followed in the pickup. After some time, all the machinery was delivered to the farm. I could not wait to test the new purchase, so I immediately detached the old tractor and attached our baler to the new one. Now it was possible to truly begin the work. After this, I immediately started working. The new tractor with wide wheels handled the viscous soil perfectly. Now the machine confidently went even over the softest areas. Thanks to this, the baling process went quickly and without any difficulties. In just a short time, I managed to collect and pack most of the mowed grass. The work went easily, and for the first time, I felt that our farm was gradually beginning to come to life. By evening, all the grass was completely pressed into round bales. There turned out to be quite a lot of them. The total number amounted to 31 bales. Since it was already dark and the day was coming to an end, I decided to put all the machinery in place and go rest. The next morning, I sat in the tractor and immediately headed to the store, because now we needed to purchase equipment for wrapping the bales in special film so that they could undergo the fermentation process and turn into silage. The wrapper itself cost us almost $9,000. In addition, I bought several additional rolls of film, which I later planned to pick up by car. Attaching the wrapper to the tractor, I headed back to the farm. As soon as I arrived, I immediately decided to start working. Driving up to the first bale, I began wrapping it, and already after a short time, it was completely covered in film. Carefully dropping it nearby, I continued wrapping the remaining bales. When the roll of film that came with the wrapper ran out, I had to run to the pickup. Sitting behind the wheel, I headed to the store, where the pre-purchased rolls were already waiting for us. Throwing them into the bed, I returned home and loaded the new rolls into the wrapper. Now it was possible to continue the work. By noon, all the bales were completely wrapped in film, and now it only remained to wait until the grass inside them completely went through the fermentation process and turned into silage. Only after that, it would be possible to sell them and receive profit. While the bales were maturing, I took care of farm chores. Beginning to bring all the machinery back to its place, I realized that we already had quite a lot of it, and it no longer fit into the old barn. Therefore, I decided to demolish the unfinished hangar and build a new, spacious one. The construction cost us about $10,000, but now all the machinery fit without problems. True, it was necessary to cut down one tree that was in the way and was pressing against the wall of the new hangar. After this, everything looked neat and truly farmer-like. I sat in the tractor and began in turn to drive all the machinery, trailers, mounted equipment, and tools under the roof of the new hangar. When everything was arranged in its places, I finally felt satisfaction from the work done. At this, the day was coming to an end. I decided to rest, because ahead of us, there are still many tasks and plans for the development of the farm. Waking up early in the morning, I immediately ran over to our hayfield to check whether the grass had finished fermenting into silage. As I got closer to one of the bales, I saw that the process had already reached 91%. That meant it was time to think about how we were going to transport all these bales. There were really a lot of them, and that's exactly what today's work would be about. So I went straight to the tractor, got behind the wheel, and headed to the store. After all, we'd have to buy some new equipment sooner or later. Once I arrived at the store, I started looking for a platform trailer that could handle the transport. I found a great option, but it cost $22,500. Money we didn't have at the moment, so I decided to head back to the farm and earn a bit more first. To make up the needed amount, I chose to sell some wood. I hooked up the log trailer and drove to the forest. After cutting down a few trees and loading them carefully, the trailer was full in no time. That meant it was time to drive to the sawmill and sell the logs. When I arrived, I sold the wood, and our balance went up by nearly $10,000. That was just enough to buy the long-awaited trailer, so I returned to the store right away and purchased it. The trailer turned out to be quite large, but luckily our new tractor had had no trouble pulling it. I hitched it up and drove back to the farm. Once home, I parked the trailer in place and immediately started loading the bales. They had just finished fermenting and turned into ready silage. I drove up to the first bale, carefully lifted it onto the platform, and went on to collect the rest. With every new bale, the trailer grew heavier, the ground beneath it started to sink, and the tractor began to lose traction. I stopped loading when I realized the tractor was barely pulling the trailer and decided to head for the dirt road. Fortunately, the machinery handled much better there, so I drove straight to the selling point. And while I was hauling this massive load of bales, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. When I arrived, I sold all the bales on the trailer and earned a bit more than $32,000. That really made me happy. I hadn't expected to earn that much. But the work wasn't over yet. A few bales still remained in the field, so I went back for them. After collecting and selling the remaining bales, I noticed that our balance had grown to just over $43,000. A fantastic result. Satisfied with the day's work, I returned home and parked the new trailer in its place. With the money I had earned, I decided to build a silage pit near the farm. I chose a rather large one that cost $20,000. It had 2 separate compartments, which was really convenient. Now we'd be able to load twice as much grass, and as a result, produce a lot more silage. After making the purchase, I returned to the farm because it was time to start filling the new silage pits. I attached the mower to the tractor and headed out to cut the grass. Even with the new tractor, the job took quite a while. The field was large and the grass was thick, but little by little, I mowed one row after another. When the sun began to set behind the horizon, I realized it was time to call it a day. I drove the tractor back to the barn and, looking over the day's work, felt satisfied. We had achieved a lot today, but there was still plenty ahead. Tomorrow, the work would continue, so I went to rest, ready to start fresh and full of energy in the morning. The next day brought perfect weather, ideal for continuing the grass mowing. Wasting no time, I jumped into our tractor and headed out to work. However, once I drove onto the field, I noticed that our canola was already fully ripe. So I decided to hire a worker to keep mowing the grass while I headed back to the farm. There, I switched to our smaller tractor and drove to the store. Because to harvest the crop, we needed a combine harvester and a trailer to unload the collected grain into. I had to choose the cheapest option since we didn't have much money, and it definitely wouldn't be enough for everything at once. In the end, I bought a harvester, a header for it, and also found a suitable trailer for $6,000. It wasn't very large, but good enough for a start. Altogether, I spent a bit more than $19,000 on all the equipment, but now we had everything we needed to begin the harvest. I attached the trailer to the tractor and the header to the harvester. Then I delivered all the equipment to the field and hired a worker who would follow me all the way back to the farm. Once we arrived, I decided to start harvesting right away. I also hired another worker to operate the harvester, while I focused on transporting the crops, delivering the harvested canola directly to the selling point. As soon as the harvester's tank was full, I drove up and he unloaded all the grain into our trailer before continuing his work. Meanwhile, our second worker on the new tractor kept mowing the grass. Hopefully, that would give us plenty of silage later. Gradually, there was less and less canola left in the field. When the trailer was completely full, I drove to the selling station. Upon arrival, I unloaded the entire harvest and received just over $7,000. Not bad for such a small field. Then I got back into the tractor and returned to the harvester, as its tank could fill up again at any moment. After some time, the harvest was finally complete. All the crops had been collected, and we filled another trailer. I took it to sell, and after the deal, our balance had risen to almost $15,000. An excellent result for the beginning of the harvest season. There was still plenty of work left for the day, so I decided not to waste any time and headed home. First, I parked all the equipment that had been used for the harvest under the shelter. While our tractor kept mowing the grass, I decided to make a quick trip to the store and use the money we had earned to buy a tedder. I managed to find a suitable model. It cost just over $1,000. I attached it to the tractor and drove to our hayfield. Once I arrived, I immediately started tedding the already cut grass, carefully spreading it into windrows. After a few rows, I noticed that our worker had just finished mowing the rest of the grass. So I replaced myself with him and switched over to the larger tractor. First, I took the mower back to the farm, and then I went to the store again. This time, I needed to buy a forage trailer, since we had to collect and transport the grass to the silage pit somehow. At the store, I bought a pretty good trailer that cost almost $13,000. Fortunately, we had just enough money in our balance to afford it. When I returned to the farm, I realized the day was already coming to an end, but there was still a lot to do. So I got straight to work. I hooked up the trailer and started collecting the grass. As soon as the trailer was full, I immediately drove the load to the silage pit. The process took much longer than I expected, but by the evening, most of the grass had already been delivered to its place. I worked until sunset. The sun had almost disappeared beyond the horizon, but I still didn't manage to collect all the grass, so I decided to call it a day. I carefully parked all the equipment in its place and went to rest. Another busy day was waiting ahead. The next morning, I had to finish collecting all the remaining grass, and there was just under half of it left. Today, we would definitely get it done. By the way, I noticed that our silage pit was already half full, which made me really happy. The work was going great, but there was no time to waste. It was time to get back to it. I got into the tractor and continued collecting the grass, determined to finish everything by the end of the day. After some time, I finally managed to finish the job. All the grass we had mowed was fully collected. Only one last trailer remained to be unloaded. We had managed to mow quite a large area, and I think that definitely deserves your like. Now we unload the final trailer, leave it in place, and begin compacting the silage so that the fermentation process can start. I should note that we managed to fill almost an entire section of the silage pit. After making several passes over the collected forage, the compaction level reached 100%. Now the mass was fully ready to be processed into silage. All that was left was to cover it with a film. Perfect! The fermentation process had begun, which meant all we had to do now was wait until it finished. I took the trailer and drove back to the farm. Since I needed something to do while waiting, I decided to sell some wood to boost our balance. At that moment, our balance was in pretty bad shape. In fact, we even had a small loan of $73. I filled one trailer with logs and took them for sale. From that trip, I managed to earn just over $13,000. Not wanting to stop there, I cut down a few more trees, filled up a second trailer, and sold it as well. After that, our balance reached almost $27,000. That seemed like a good point to end the working day. I neatly parked all the equipment in its place and went to rest. The next day, I went back to work in the forest. With the money I had earned yesterday, I decided to build a small log storage area right next to the spot where we usually cut down trees. It cost $10,000 and would be very useful in the future, since I was already planning to set up my own sawmill there. However, we didn't have much money left, so I decided to cut another full trailer of logs and and take it for sale to increase our balance a bit. On the way, I stopped by the silage pit. The fermentation process had already passed 90%, which meant we'd soon be able to start selling. For now, I kept going and sold the logs. After that, our balance rose to just over $29,000. I decided to stop by the store to check how much a winch would cost. It would be really useful for forestry work, but honestly, the prices were disappointing. Everything was far too expensive, so I drove back to the farm. Passing by the silage pit, I noticed that the fermentation was almost complete, and it would soon be time to start transporting. I parked the trailer and began preparing for the sale of silage. To load it quickly into the trailer, I needed the right equipment. At the store, I found a small auger that perfectly fit our needs. It cost only $2,000, so I bought it right away and headed to the silage pit. By the time I arrived, the silage was fully ready. I set up the auger, went to get the trailer, positioned it, and started loading. I took the first trailer full of silage to the selling point and received $1,500 for it. That's when I realized that at this rate, it would take forever to transport everything, since there was still a massive amount of silage left in the pit. So I went back to the store and found a large trailer priced at $19,000. Without hesitation, I bought it and sold the old one. The new trailer was supposed to speed up transportation several times over, as it could hold almost 10 times more than the previous one. I hooked it up to the tractor and drove back to the silage pit. But as I got closer, I realized the trailer was too tall and the auger simply couldn't reach its body. I had no choice but to get into the pickup truck and take the auger back to the store. I sold the old auger and bought a new one, the same model but 1.5 meters longer. After setting it up, I immediately started filling the trailer with silage. After some time, the trailer was completely loaded. Then I headed to the selling point. Honestly, I was quite surprised that our tractor, although struggling a bit, still managed to pull a trailer fully loaded with silage. Even more impressive, I got to the destination fairly quickly. Now it was time to unload everything I had brought. For one trailer like that, we earned almost $16,000. A very good result, especially considering that we still had enough silage left for several more trailers, maybe even more. Now I had to transport all the remaining silage and completely empty the pit. All this time, I kept loading and selling our own silage. By the time it started getting dark outside, I had managed to earn just over $74,000. However, there was still quite a lot of silage left in the pit, so I decided to continue the work the next day. For now, I was done. I carefully parked all the equipment and went to rest. The next morning, I got back to transporting again, and when the last trailer was finally unloaded and sold, our balance reached just over $101,000. That really amazed me. After all, we had earned such a huge amount just from selling silage. I decided to head home and put that money to good use. First of all, I built a small sawmill of my own where we could now produce planks and beams. In addition, I finally decided to get rid of the old unfinished house on our farm and build a new, modern home so I could finally move out of the tent and live in proper comfort. Of course, the money we earned disappeared pretty quickly, but the result was absolutely worth it. Our farm had noticeably transformed, and the new house looked simply amazing. Waking up in the morning, I got out of my house and stepped outside. Winter had come. Light snow was falling, and everything around was covered with a thin white layer. But even such weather didn't stop us. There was work to do and money to earn. I headed toward our tractor. Sitting down in the cab, I noticed that the fuel tank was almost empty. Fortunately, there was still a full canister of diesel in our pickup truck. I took it, poured the fuel in, and checked the level again. Everything was fine now. I attached the trailer and went to the forest to make some money selling wood. I decided to sell several trailers of raw logs right away to save up for new equipment. I cut down a few trees, loaded everything into the trailer, and drove to the sawmill. When I arrived, I removed all the straps and sold the logs. For the entire trailer, I was paid just over $13,000. Quite a decent amount. I was about to head home, but decided to stop by the store on the way. There, I saw the exact piece of equipment I needed for moving logs. It cost $38,000, and I was short by just about $1,000. So, I went back to the forest, cut down a few more trees, and took a new load for sale. After that, our balance reached just over $50,000. Now I definitely had enough. I returned to the store and bought the device. It was a tall tower with a cable system that allows you to stretch lines between trees and move the felled logs along them. A very handy thing that can greatly speed up the work. To pick up the purchase, I first took the trailer back home and left it in the parking area. Then I returned to the store with the tractor alone, hooked up the new winch, and headed back to the forest. There, I set up the tractor near the sawmill, stretched the cable, and fixed it to a tree in the center of the forest. Once everything was ready, we had a carriage that could travel along the line and drag the logs across. Now it was time to begin a new, more convenient, and much faster way of working. I was just about to start working when I noticed an important detail. The support stakes that keep the tractor from tipping over under the weight of the logs were installed on the wrong side. That's when I realized I had positioned the tractor incorrectly. Not wanting to waste time, I quickly moved it and reattached the cable. This time, everything was set up securely, and the chance of anything going wrong was minimal. Everything was ready. Time to start the winch. Now we could control the hook remotely. It moved along the cable and allowed us to lift and transport the logs. To reduce the load on the line, I decided to cut each log into several pieces. When the hook stopped right above the desired trunk, I attached a strap to it and tightened the cable. The log smoothly rose off the ground. After that, all that was left was to move it straight to the sawmill. The cable ran directly above the loading point, so the wood went straight into storage. Very convenient. From just one small tree, we managed to load almost 2,000 liters of wood into our sawmill. The winch turned out to be really useful, so I kept working, hauling one log after another. Occasionally, I came across trunks that were too heavy. The winch couldn't lift those, so I had to cut them into smaller pieces. But even with that, the work went quickly. In just a few minutes, we were able to load an entire tree into the storage area. I continued cutting. After the second tree, our sawmill was already completely full. I left one large log nearby. As soon as the wood in the sawmill was processed, that log would be next. Since there was no more space for loading, I started the production of beams. After that, I decided to move the winch closer to the log storage area to start filling it up and build up a supply. Having some wood stockpiled is always useful. I set up the tractor behind the storage building, stretched a new cable, and got to work. Things went smoothly. I cut down trees and immediately moved them into storage. I barely had to spend any time on loading or unloading, which made the process much faster. By evening, our storage was filled with a bit more than 16,000 liters of wood. The sun was setting and it was getting dark. I decided that was enough for the day. I carefully shut down the equipment, packed everything up, and drove back to the farm. After parking the tractor, I finally went to rest. The next morning, the weather was perfect, just right to continue filling the log storage. I started up the tractor and headed to our sawmill. There, I stretched the cable once again and began cutting down trees. One after another, I moved the logs into storage. The work was steady and consistent. I worked for quite a while, and by the time the first snow began to fall, the storage was almost full. Fortunately, I I managed to finish just in time. Now we had 75,000 litres of wood in reserve, which could be processed or sold at any moment if needed. I packed up all the equipment and was about to head back to the farm when I noticed several stumps left along the roads near the sawmill. I decided to deal with them right away. After all, the snowfall had already started and it was impossible to do any other kind of work. I took the winch back to the farm and then went to the store to look for some equipment for stump removal, something suitable and not too expensive, something we could afford. At the store, I found a small mulcher priced at $4,000. I was a bit concerned about its size. It didn't look like it could handle our stumps. Still, I decided to give it a try. I got into the tractor, attached the equipment, and headed back to the sawmill. By the time I returned from the store, the snowfall had just stopped. Once I arrived, I immediately started working. I tried removing the stumps along the road. However, it quickly became clear that our mulcher simply couldn't handle the task. It wasn't able to grip the larger stumps and only slightly shredded the soil around them. Disappointed, I decided to take it back to the store. Since we didn't have enough money yet for more powerful equipment, I had to leave everything as it was until better times. When I got home, I parked all the machinery and decided that was enough for the day. It was already getting dark by then. I went to rest and, you could say, spent the rest of the winter quietly, giving both myself and the equipment some time to recover. When I woke up, the calendar already showed April. Everything around was blooming. The snow had melted and spring had finally arrived for real. There was a lot of work ahead. It was time to put in some serious effort to earn more money and move forward. Early in the morning, I got into our pickup truck and drove to the sawmill. I wanted to see how many beams our production had made. By that time, one pallet was already ready. Quite a good result, I must say. We'll sell it a bit later, once more have accumulated. For today, however, I plan to work on our field, which I wanted to expand. In addition, the silage pit needed to be filled with fresh grass, so I decided to sow in another area. The land there was larger, which was very convenient. The first thing I did was prepare the tractor for mowing, but when I sat down in the cab, I saw that the diesel was almost gone. I immediately ran to check the canisters in the pickup's bed, but they were all empty. I had no choice but to go get new fuel. Before that, I carefully unloaded everything from the pickup and stacked it in the corner of the shed so it wouldn't get in the way, leaving only a set of tools, just in case something unexpected happened. After that, I could finally head to the store for diesel for our tractors. This time, I decided to buy several barrels, which cost us a little over $1,000. I loaded them into the pickup, strapped them down tightly so they wouldn't shift on the road, and headed back to the farm. Work was waiting. When I arrived, I unloaded a couple of barrels into the shed and placed one outside, closer to the machinery. Then I drove the tractor up to it and filled the tank completely. Perfect. Now we could get to work. I attached the mower and drove out to the field to start cutting the grass. To save time, I decided to hire a worker, let him handle the mowing, while I focused on preparing the field. I got into our larger tractor, hooked up the cultivator, and headed to the field. I planned to expand it, both in length and width, so we could harvest more in the future. There was a lot to do. The worker and I spent quite some time at it, each doing our part, and little by little, the farm was coming back to life. It was only by evening that I finally managed to finish expanding the field. Now it was about twice as large as before, and we would be able to harvest much more from it. By that time, the worker hadn't even finished mowing half of the hayfield I had planned, but we would take care of that the next day. Even though we didn't manage to do everything we wanted, the result was still excellent. I carefully parked all the equipment and, feeling pleasantly tired, went to rest. The next day, I left a worker to continue mowing the grass while I headed to the farm. It was time to start planting a new crop. This time, I decided to sow soybeans, since it was the right season for them. Besides, our header was already suitable for harvesting soybeans, which made the choice even more convenient. I started the tractor, attached the seeder, and drove out to the field. Gradually, the field began to fill with rows of seeds, while the worker continued mowing the grass. When he finished, I hired another worker, this time to help with planting, so the process would move faster. As for me, I went to the hayfield. It was time to start preparing the grass. I detached the mower and attached the windrower instead, so I could start forming neat rows of grass. It would make collecting it much easier later. Once the equipment was ready, I drove out to the hayfield and assigned another worker there as well. By that time, our large tractor had already finished working with the soybeans. The entire field was fully planted and ready. That meant it was time to move on to the next stage. Transporting the grass, I hooked up the forage trailer. A new phase of work was about to begin. I headed to the hayfield to start collecting the grass that our worker had just laid into windrows. Gradually, I loaded the forage trailer and transported the grass to our silage pit. The work went slowly but steadily. With each trip, the pit filled up more and more. By the end of the day, I had managed to transport about half of all the grass. With that, I decided to call it a day. I carefully parked all the equipment and went to rest. Tomorrow promised to be another busy day. The next morning, I looked out the window and saw that the weather was perfect, an ideal time to finish transporting the forage. I quickly headed to the tractor, attached the trailer, and drove to the hayfield to continue collecting the grass. During this time, I managed to completely fill the 11th section of our silage pit and had to start filling the second one. When all the grass was finally transported, I detached the trailer and began compacting the forage with the tractor. The process took quite a while, but when the compaction level reached 100%, I covered the entire mass, nearly 260,000 liters of forage we had collected. With a special fill, I think that amount definitely deserves a like. Now, all that was left was to wait until the forage fully fermented into silage. While it was processing, I decided to take care of other things. I attached the flatbed trailer and headed to our sawmill. New pallets of beams should have been produced there by now. As I expected, by that time, about 1,600 liters of beams had accumulated. I loaded them all onto the platform and drove to the selling point. For the beams I sold, I received almost $22,000. Quite a good amount, especially considering it took very little time to earn it. Now it was time to head home. I decided to spend part of the money we had earned on a small improvement to our farm, building a chicken coop. But first, I had to remove the old broken pen. After clearing it out, I built a new coop which cost us about $2,500. It looked absolutely wonderful, but now we needed to buy chickens for it, and that could only be done at the animal dealer. I ran to our pickup truck, got behind the wheel, and drove there. Luckily, the place was not far from the store, so I knew the road well. Once I arrived, I decided to buy baby chicks, just enough to fill our new coop. After that, I also needed to get some feed. I stopped by the store and bought 2 bags of chicken feed, which cost us around $3,000. I think that supply should last them quite a while. After securing the bags in the truck bed, I headed back to the farm. When I arrived, I saw that the chicks had already been delivered to the pen. They were tiny, especially compared to me. Now all that was left was to load the feed into the trough. I drove behind the house to the storage area and carefully unloaded the bags. That's it. Everything was ready. All we had to do now was wait for our little chicks to grow up. Since there was still some money left in the account, I decided to invest it wisely and built a couple of greenhouses next to the house where we could grow vegetables for sale. The construction cost only $6,000, and they would also bring in additional income, which would definitely come in handy. That's where I decided to end the day. Waking up in the morning, I saw that our farm had already grown quite a lot. But of course, we weren't planning to stop there. We already had a large field, plenty of equipment, and newly installed greenhouses that, by the way, it was finally time to put into operation. To run them, we needed water, and to transport that water, we needed a tank. So I got into our pickup truck and headed to the store to buy everything we needed. There, my attention was caught by a pretty good water tank, priced at almost $6,000. Our pickup could pull it without any problem, and the pump installed on it would speed up the filling process a lot. After hooking the tank to the pickup, I drove to the river not far from the farm. When I arrived, it became clear that getting close to the water would be difficult. So in construction mode, I leveled the ground a bit. Now we've got the perfect spot to collect water. After arriving at the spot, I filled the tank completely and then headed to our greenhouses. I carefully drove up to the first unloading point and filled its reservoir to the top. Now, one of the greenhouses was almost halfway full, so I decided to turn it on right away so it could start producing. In this greenhouse, I chose to grow tomatoes. They yield quite a lot, which means we'll be able to earn more when we sell them later. We still had 2 more greenhouses to fill, so I immediately went back to the river to collect another tank of water. After filling the second greenhouse, I also activated it, but this time I planted cabbage, which also gives a pretty solid harvest. After that, I returned to the river again to completely fill the storage tanks of both greenhouses with water. After some time, all the reservoirs were fully filled, and now all we needed to do was replenish them from time to time. From here on out, we'd be getting regular harvests that we could sell anytime we wanted. After that, I parked the tank next to our equipment and went to check how things were going in the silage pit. As you remember, we packed a huge amount of grass in there, and I'm expecting the silage to earn us enough money to fully pay off all our work. When I checked the fermentation status, I saw that the process was completely finished, and we now had almost 260,000 liters of silage ready. Without wasting any time, I got into our pickup and drove back to the farm to start preparing for the sale. I also noticed that we were running out of space for our equipment, so in the future, we'll need to build a larger shed to make sure everything fits under a roof. But for now, it was time to focus on selling the silage. I got into the tractor, attached our huge trailer, and headed to the pit to begin loading. After removing the cover from one of the sections, I set up the loading auger, carefully backed the trailer underneath it, and began the loading process. Thanks to the auger, the silage was transferred from the pit to the trailer fairly quickly. After some time, the trailer was completely full, and I drove to the selling point. Once I arrived, I unloaded the silage, and for a single full trailer, we earned almost $16,000. Not bad at all, especially considering how much silage we still have left. During the remaining hours of the day, I kept transporting silage from our pit to the selling point. By the time I delivered the last trailer, our balance had reached almost $110,000, and of course, that made me really happy. I finished work just as the sun was setting. As I calmly headed back to the farm, I felt tired, but at the same time incredibly satisfied. We had earned a lot, and this money would go toward expanding and increasing our farm's income. With the day's work done, I parked the equipment, ran into the house, and went to sleep in our cozy bed. The next morning, the weather was gloomy, but that didn't stop me. I had plenty to do. I planned to take care of our sawmill. I immediately headed to the tractor, attached the winch, and drove to the sawmill. Upon arriving, I decided to invest all our hard-earned money into building a large sawmill that could bring in tens of thousands of dollars every month. I hoped it would pay for itself quickly, because we had spent almost our entire balance on it. After placing the building, I jumped back into the tractor and positioned it properly. I wanted to start loading wood as soon as possible to launch production. and begin earning back the investment. When the tractor was in place, I stretched the winch cable and began pulling the logs toward the sawmill. After dragging one fallen tree over, I loaded it into the storage area. We now had just over 8,000 litres of wood there. I immediately turned on every possible production line in the sawmill and saw that the wood was being consumed very quickly. So I rushed back into the forest to cut down more trees and refill the storage. I worked until late in the evening and during that time managed to load just over 85,000 litres of wood. It was exhausting, and since the production line processes it incredibly fast, by the end of the day we already had plenty of goods ready to be sold. But I decided to handle that later. I was completely worn out after such a long day, so I packed up the winch, got into the tractor, and returned to the farm. After parking the equipment, I went to rest. The next day, as soon as I stepped outside, I headed straight for our pickup. Overnight, the sawmill should have processed a huge amount of wood into valuable products. On the way there, I really hoped that was the case. When I arrived at the sawmill, I hurried to check the production. I was stunned. All the wood we had loaded into the storage yesterday had been fully processed. We now had a massive amount of products that could be sold for a significant profit. Honestly, I was incredibly happy. All our hard work was paying off. Now I just had to figure out how to transport everything. I got into the pickup and drove back to the farm. There, I switched to the tractor and attached the bale trailer. I wanted to transport at least a small portion of the goods, so I could later buy myself a larger platform. Returning to the sawmill, I carefully pulled under the shed and unloaded a small batch of pallets that had been produced overnight. Then I had to load them onto the trailer. Luckily, I managed to do it quickly. Everything was strapped down securely, and I could head to the selling point. Once I arrived, I began unloading. For a full platform of pallets, we earned almost $88,000. And I was pleasantly surprised, but there was still a lot left in storage, so I hurried back. When the second platform was loaded, I set off for the selling point again. This time, besides pallets, we were also selling various wooden products, barrels, planks, and even dog houses. For this load, we received almost another $80,000. When I sold the last trailer load, our balance reached just over $306,000. It was an enormous amount. Our new sawmill had paid for itself almost 3.5 times, which felt absolutely unbelievable. Now we had enough money to buy new equipment and construct new buildings. I headed back to the farm and decided to focus on improving it. Since we simply had no space left for new machinery, I decided to sell the very first shed we built during our early months on the farm. But first, I needed to move out all the equipment and tools stored inside. Once everything was cleared, I brought over the platform trailer and loaded the remaining supplies onto it. After that, I demolished the old shed and installed a massive shelter in its place, big enough to comfortably fit all our equipment. It cost us just over $35,000, but it was absolutely worth the price. The size alone was impressive. Then I started arranging all our equipment under the new shelter. Using the tractor, I moved all our trailers and attachments into their new spots. Once that was done, I decided to take our baler to the store. We weren't using it at the moment. Anyway, now everything was neatly organized and every piece of equipment finally had enough space. After that, I started cleaning up the trash that had been accumulating around the farm. I removed the old broken pig pens, various unnecessary tools, and all the junk lying around the property. The only thing left was to haul away the old barrels near the entrance, so I pulled up the platform. Now, I just had to figure out how to load the old barrels onto the platform. They turned out to be quite heavy, so I got into our pickup and drove to the store. I decided to buy a loader. It wasn't cheap, but we had plenty of money. A loader like this would be extremely useful for future farm work, so I didn't mind spending money on such an essential piece of equipment. I put a worker behind the wheel and we headed back to the farm. Once we arrived, I began loading the barrels onto the platform. By the end of the day, it was completely full. All that remained was to transport them, but I decided to do that in the morning. It was already dark. I parked the equipment and went to rest. The next day, I ran to the tractor, strapped down all the barrels, and drove to the railroad station. When I got there, all that was left was to unload them. Once the job was done, I headed back to the farm. After returning, I parked the tractor and platform and began clearing the tall grass that had grown over the road and around the property. When I finished, the whole area looked much better. Next, I decided to sell our bale platform. I hooked it up to the tractor and drove to the store. Selling the platform freed up some money, and I decided to buy a truck along with a large platform for it. I was really happy with this purchase. Now it finally felt like the farm was generating a stable income and we could afford serious investments. I also remembered that I had forgotten to buy a log grapple for our loader, since I planned to use it at the sawmill as well. At the same time, I bought a mulcher to remove the stumps left after cutting down trees. After loading all the new equipment onto the platform, I strapped it down and headed home. There, I also loaded our loader onto the platform, then drove to the sawmill. Upon arriving, I unloaded the equipment and first decided to remove the stumps that were blocking the entrance. I cut down all the stumps that were on the farm property. After that, I switched to the loader and transported all the wood we had prepared earlier to the production site so it could keep working as quickly as possible. By evening, all the work was finished, and our storage was already filled with a large amount of produced goods. I decided to call it a day and began transporting the equipment back to the farm. After some time, everything was in its place, and I went to rest. The next morning, I immediately checked the production status on the farm. Our greenhouses had already produced several pallets of goods. I also decided to check on our chickens. It turned out that while I was gone, they had grown and even produced a full pallet of eggs. So, the first thing I did was get into the truck and start collecting all the products. Once everything produced on the farm was loaded, I went to the store and earned almost $8,000 for it. Quite good, considering we barely had to do anything for that money. Then I headed to the sawmill. There, too, a lot of goods had accumulated. I immediately started loading the wooden products onto our truck. I loaded so much that the truck could barely pull all of it across the soft soil of the sawmill, but I managed to get back onto solid ground and drove to the selling point. Our balance rose to nearly $300,000. I decided to invest this money in purchasing a new tractor. I chose a powerful tracked tractor, much stronger than our old one. I placed a worker in the truck and headed back to the farm. After parking the truck, I attached a trailer to the new tractor and drove to the sawmill. A huge amount of wood chips had piled up there, and they could be sold too. I managed to fill almost an entire trailer, after which I went to the selling point. After unloading all the wood chips, we earned nearly $20,000, which was also quite good. It was time to return to the farm. I parked the tractor under the shelter, then decided to build a huge pig pen and a slurry pit. After that, I ran to the pickup, got in, and drove to the animal dealer to buy a small number of pigs that we would raise. When I returned to the farm, I saw that the pigs had already been delivered. Now our farm was fully restored. It was bringing in tens of thousands of dollars. We had a huge field and many animals. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.